Okay, this first lecture is going to be about an overview of the course, some of the main concepts and themes that we'll revisit throughout the course, the activities to expect throughout the course, and some of the changes since the beginning. So initially, as you know, we were going to have our discussions due on Wednesday, and it became clear to me that that doesn't make a lot of sense because it doesn't give you enough time really to engage in the discussions, and because you need to log out, come back, see what people's comments are, and so forth. So to streamline and make things a little bit simpler, everything's just going to be due on Fridays. And that so far I've really enjoyed reading your discussions and your journals. You're doing a fantastic job there. With journals, everybody, I think, has successfully established a WordPress account. If you still are struggling with that, let me know. I think that there are a couple of people I asked if it was there because I had the text, but I didn't have the link. So, but you've been doing a great job troubleshooting and working through the technological logistics. So bravo on that. The individual assignments are due bi-weekly and due on Fridays. And so starting this next week, you should have the same pattern where there are discussions every week and then alternating weeks of the journals and individual assignments. Now, you all probably know that there are two sections of this class, the in-person class and the online class. You each are doing a different group project, and those projects are going to be shared. So in about 2 weeks, I'm going to give you the details on the group project, and you will get to choose your groups. The discussions and some of the things that you've been doing with the habits of sustainable living, you were randomly assigned to groups, but you're going to be able to join a group project based on your interests. And so I'll be giving you a little bit more information on that in a couple of weeks. And then we'll have specific checkpoints what the progress is, where you'll be sharing what you've done so far, and I'll give you feedback and so forth. And then at the very end, your final presentation, you will record it online so that the in-person class can view your presentation, and you'll also be able to view the presentations of the in-class groups as well. So I'll give you the details about the group paper, how you'll do your evaluation of the group, and then your own individual papers and reflection on the process. So that'll be coming up in a couple of weeks. Right now we're just getting our feet under us with the routines and navigating the technology and so forth. Okay, so throughout the class we're going to explore some of these concepts in addition to many more, but we'll keep revisiting some of these. So first of all, just what is sustainability? And I have to say that the first time I taught a class on this topic was about 4 years ago, and at that point it was really not part of mainstream language or consciousness, and I have to say there's been a tremendous change in the interim. Even a year and a half ago when I proposed this course so that it could be approved, a faculty member said, "What is sustainability? I have no idea what you're talking about." So it's a relatively new concept to many people, and it is just now becoming part of our mainstream awareness. So we're going to explore what it is and how it's related to people and their relationships, so human communities within families and communities, environments, so built environments and natural environments, as well as economic systems. And so economic systems are human systems. So overall, we're going to be looking at human systems, natural systems, and how those interact with each other. Now, in your introductions and your description of what nature is, a lot of you have sort of a continuum in terms of where humans lie on the nature continuum. So for some of you, you clearly placed humans right in your definition of nature, and for other people, you seem to sort of separate humans from nature, and for others there was sort of a fuzzy boundary there. So continue to think about for yourself, do you consider yourself as a human being to be part of nature? How do we measure human sustainability? How do we know if we're sustainable? You discussed some great concepts about resilience with respect to the power of community video. And so think about what kinds of indicators would tell us how sustainable, how we're doing. And then the conceptualization, theoretical and conceptual, of human development and ecological systems. And so for many of you, Bronfenbrenner's ecological theory is familiar. For others of you, this might be the first time you're looking at it in this context, because one of the things about this class is that there are students from all majors involved, and so that makes a variety of different backgrounds. And so some of you it might be review, others perhaps not. And then how can the concept of sustainability and our deepening understanding of it be used to promote the health and well-being of people and the environment? So a lot of times when people talk about, write about, hear about sustainability, it's focusing just on the environment. But truly sustainability concerns both people and the environment, and so we are looking for ways to understand this as benefiting both. Okay, so many or most of you are probably familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and the reason that I wrote "not a" in here is because more recent research has suggested that this is really not a hierarchy, that all are necessary. And so initially Maslow was thinking that physiological needs need to be met first before you can move on to other levels of the hierarchy. But for example, things like safety and love and belongingness, as they're expressed in attachment relationships, are equally important, and perhaps some of the other levels as well. So as an example, several years ago I was the director of the Child Development Lab, and we had a pair of siblings in the class, and the students were really concerned that the siblings were particularly dependent on each other, and decided one day to seat them at separate tables during lunchtime. And so I was on the other side of the building, and I heard, some distress and crying, and so I went into the observation booth, and I saw both kids. One of them had his head down on the table, and the other was crying. Both of them were clearly distressed, and so I asked what was going on. They explained that they were concerned that they were too dependent on each other, and the older sibling was going to go to kindergarten the following year, and so the younger sibling had to get used to being without the older sibling. Needless to say, neither one of them was eating. So if you would think of physiological as the need for food and nutrition, clearly their need for the safety and love and belongingness is reflected in their attachment to each other, overrode the physiological need in the moment. And so I ensured that the two siblings were reunited, and we discussed, the processes of transition and how we didn't need to worry about separating the brother in order to prepare him for the next year. That would be a process in and of itself. We don't separate an infant from the mother just to get used to spending less time together. So each of these are important human needs that need to be fulfilled in a system that is sustainable. We all have physiological needs for air, water, food, and I should clarify, clean air, water, and food, shelter, space, sex, sleep, warmth, and so forth. Safety is both physical safety and psychological safety, so stability and security from crime, disease, poverty, as well as psychological security. Excuse me, love, the giving and receiving of love and affection, esteem, the self-respect and respect of others. Cognitive needs, we need cognitive stimulation of learning, novelty, knowledge, meaning, and order. And aesthetic refers to our appreciation of beauty, balance, and form. So for many of you, when you were writing about your nature immersion experience, you referred to aesthetics. So your appreciation of the beauty of sunsets and the sounds and so forth. That was the aesthetic need. And then self-actualization is becoming all we can be, not to be trite, but that's really one of the ways that it's described. But even further from that, fulfilling a purpose, having a purpose in life, connecting with something larger than yourself. So for some people, they might describe this as a spiritual dimension. So these are some of the dimensions that we can look at and think about, okay, so how well are we meeting these to determine where we are in terms of sustainability? Okay, many of you are probably familiar with Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, which he drew from ecological theory in terms of natural sciences. But I'm posing a question here, which is, where is nature? Because the way that you have probably learned about it in family science or in psychology or other social sciences, natural systems aren't depicted as part of that. So let's take a look at ecology, and to understand ecology I consulted the authority of Wikipedia. And Wikipedia in itself is a really interesting system because it is an open knowledge system. It's something that anybody can contribute to, although incidentally most Wikipedia entries are made by males. So women are underrepresented in Wikipedia, in case anybody wants to go out and edit some Wikipedia entries. But going to what the meaning, the root meaning of the word ecology, from household and knowledge, it's very interesting because we can think of household either as a human household or household as an ecosystem. So it's interdisciplinary, which is important. It doesn't belong to just one school of thought. And it's scientific, which means that we use systematic ways to study and gain knowledge about interactions between organisms and their environments. So any organism and any environment. Ecology is also the study of ecosystems. So a system is a web or network of relations among organisms at different scales of organization. So you can think about ecosystems as networks of relations between people within their nuclear family, their extended family, their friends and neighbors, associations with other institutions and communities like churches, schools, childcare, and so forth. Or you can think about the network of relations between insects, vertebrates, invertebrates, plants, water, and elements within a system, whether it's a prairie, a forest, a wetland, but it's about what those relationships are and the roles that each organism plays. Okay, so the ecology of human development, if we're talking about people, individuals, and families, it's the scientific study, which means we collect data in a very systematic way of the progressive mutual accommodation, meaning over time, both the human and the environment are changing and accommodating to each other. So change is something that is a property of all systems and of all individuals. It's not stagnant. It can be stable, but it's not stagnant. So the progressive mutual accommodation throughout the life course, so there's change across the lifespan. We never stop developing. We never stop growing. Excuse me, between an active, growing human being. And why is this so important to talk about active? Well, children contribute to their own development. Sometimes when people talk about children, they use a metaphor, for example, of a sponge. A sponge absorbs everything around it. Well, a sponge is a very passive thing. It's an object that just soaks up water. That is similar to what some people have referred to as social mold theories. Do you think of the child as a ball of clay, or do you think of the child as a person who is actively contributing to their own development? And there are lots of ways that kids do this. They do it by exploring their environments and constructing knowledge from the kinds of experimentation and things that they're discovering as they navigate the physical and social world. They contribute to their development by exploring and thinking about things and creating experiences for themselves. And they certainly contribute to their own development by identifying patterns in their environment and understanding things, whether they're number, category, and so forth. So one of the first things, for example, that infants learn is the difference between living and non-living, and they clearly differentiate between that. So their ability to do that is really important. In a social aspect, even infants and very young children are actively contributing to their social interactions, whether it's through making eye contact, smiling to bring a caregiver closer, crying to bring a caregiver closer, vocalizing, reaching out to interact. They are definitely not passive. So children are active, and And the settings are also active in development because the settings are continually changing, whether it is a family, and families change. Everybody is growing and getting older, but a variety of other things happen. Parents change their careers, for example, or families add and subtract members, and so there are things that are happening in the setting as well. And so what we're interested in is the interaction between the individual and their settings and between the settings themselves. So to depict this, Bronfenbrenner had nested systems. Now we can think about lots of different examples of what is a system, and here we're considering individual human beings to be a system, but families are also a system. So the microsystem, from the perspective of the child, is the immediate setting where you would find the child. So primarily talking about the family here, but also the child exists often within an early childhood education environment. That's also a microsystem or a school system. So that's an immediate system where they find themselves. But systems can be bigger than that. The exosystem is really the wider community and places where the child might not necessarily occupy directly, but they're affected by nonetheless. So the exosystem would involve things like the parent's employment and institutions in the community that influence the child's development. And then the macro system, wider than that, really refers to the social, political, economic, cultural systems. And then below that is represented time, because each of those systems is changing over time. So you can imagine movement represented by change, or change represented by movement across time in each one of those systems. But it's important to realize that there are systems smaller than a human individual. So we have systems within us. All systems are hierarchically or arranged or nested within themselves. So we have respiratory, digestive, endocrine systems, and so forth. But we also have cells. Each cell is a system, and cells have systems within them. And you can get really down to, a molecular and atomic level to think about systems, because those components relate to each other in very specific ways that are patterned and predictable. And we can also get much bigger in terms of systems than cultures, economic, social systems, and political systems, because we can think about ecosystems, we can think about biomes, certainly we can think of oceanic systems and the Earth as a system as well. And then beyond that to our moon, we exist in a systemic relationship with our moon. There's our own solar system, our galaxy, and then there are actually even systems of galaxies that rotate around each other. So it gets even bigger than that in terms of the universe. So think about systems as being from the very tiny and minute to the immense, and that there are connections among all of those systems. Now, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, one of the interesting things to me is that Bronfenbrenner, in all of his writings, never really refers to the human interaction with natural systems. From my perspective, if I'm to ask where is nature, I think it's really cutting across all of these. So, in addressing the question of what is nature in our very first class, and some of you included people and families and human communities, I see nature as being within that microsystem, because I think of the child as nature and the relationships between children and their families as nature, natural relationships. But also, we all are continually using these things that meet our needs, like physiological needs. We need air, water, food. These are all nature. We need shelter, and we manipulate nature to create shelter and so forth. And the processes that we're engaging in with our bodies are also nature, so things like sleeping and eating. Same thing in the exosystem. You regardless of whether you're indoors or outdoors, there's a constant interaction with natural systems, whether those are resources or or where they're located, or human communities interacting with each other. And certainly social and economic systems have huge interactions with the natural world, whether you're talking about extraction and manipulation of resources or the location of cities. Cities and communities tend to arise where there are sufficient resources. So I see it as being interactions within all of the levels of Brown von Brenner's ecosystems, as nature being there. Okay, I'm going to introduce a working definition of sustainability from John Dernbach, who's a faculty member and lawyer. And so he has offered this definition, which is something is environmentally or ecologically sustainable when it protects, restores, or regenerates the environment rather than degrades it. Now, I'm going to contrast this with some of the earlier definitions of things like environmentalism. So that really, being an environmentalist or something being environmentally conscious really had to do with protection. Sustainability is different. It's more akin to the concept of resilience that you wrote about last week because it goes on to the processes of restoration or regeneration. So if something is sustainable, if it can continue to regenerate itself over time. So when we apply this to the environment, it means the environment can meet its needs without intervention. So for example, without human intervention. And by meeting its needs can stay in balance. And some of you referred to balance as well. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the term sustainability has moved really from fringe to common vernacular, and it can be applied to many aspects of systems, from environmental systems to healthcare systems, for example. And we frequently hear politicians state that with respect to healthcare, the path we are on is unsustainable. Those words specifically. Think about, what does that mean? It means that if we continue with the status quo, either one, people will not be able to get the health care they need, and in fact that's already been happening for quite some time, and or two, the costs of health care, really what is medical care rather than health care more broadly, will bankrupt individuals but also institutions. And so, as you know, many individual bankruptcies, a significant proportion of them are a consequence of medical bills, so they're kind of referred to as medical bankruptcies. But also institutions, care providers, and governmental entities would go bankrupt. And so there are multiple ways that things can fail to be sustainable. And this is an example of applying that beyond ecosystems. So when something is unsustainable, the status quo will inevitably lead to its demise. So unsustainability is a path to decline, dissolution, crisis, and destruction, either from within or from without. So unhealthy habits are unsustainable. So for example, we talked about sleep and the need for sleep. You can only go for so long without sleep. I remember there was a point in time when I was much younger when I thought that sleep was a waste of time. Think of all the things you could be doing. And of course you can imagine what happens after you go on sleep deprivation. I'm sure you've all experienced for a long period of time. You experience a lot of illness. That's unsustainable. Okay, applied to a variety of organisms, systems, entities that can be sustainable, think of some examples of things an individual might do that would be unsustainable, that would threaten an individual's ability to restore, rejuvenate, and meet their physical and psychosocial needs. You can think in terms of Maslow's hierarchy. You can think about what makes a family sustainable. Some of you might be familiar with Dr. Dufresne's family strengths theory. Dr. Dufresne retired from the Child, Youth, and Family Studies Department about 3 years ago, but he developed a family strengths theory, validated it in a variety of different cultures, and then it has now been applied by a cooperative extension in terms of activities to strengthen families. Now that he's retired, he is coordinating family strengths conferences all over the world. And so there are certain things that make families sustainable. We talked about this in the in-person class the other day, and one of the first things, well actually the first thing that all of the groups came up with in terms of families was communication as being something that helps families to be sustainable. But think about what are characteristics of sustainable communities too. And keep in mind it's, protecting, restoring, regenerating. So what makes you talked a little bit about Lincoln and or your hometowns as well, and what kinds of things make them sustainable communities. Or ecosystems, of course, where what most people think about when we use the word sustainability. When an ecosystem is sustainable, it's in balance. It can recover from various assaults on it. When an ecosystem becomes unsustainable, it's been injured in a way that makes recovery impossible, sometimes at all or sometimes without substantial intervention. So you'll be reading about mountaintop removal and what is the probability that you can really restore an ecosystem after that's been experienced. Other examples of things like overgrazing or overtilling, loss of topsoil, invasion of weeds, pests, invasive species. In some cases, simply letting the land lie fallow will not allow it to recover to its initial state, whether that's prairie or forest or what have you, because the interdependent community of life that supported it was dismantled. So for example, I lived in Arizona for 5.5 years, and I learned that there had been many wetlands in Arizona, but the beaver were hunted to extinction out there, and beaver were a keystone species. The beaver dams helped to maintain the ecosystem, and when the beavers were removed, that land turned into desert. And I'm not saying that was that's the reason that all of Arizona is a desert, but certain parts of Arizona that certainly contributed. Wolves are also a keystone species in some of the areas of the Great Plains in the west where wolves were eliminated. Deer would eat within the waterways and creeks. They would eat down to the ground, and then there would be erosion, because if there are no predators, the deer don't have to keep moving along. There's nothing to be afraid of out there. There's no danger. When the wolves were reintroduced, the wetlands became more healthy because the deer would need to come get a drink, and then they would need to beat feet. They couldn't just hang around all day munching, because it is dangerous. The relationship between bison and the Great Plains, similarly, the bison really help to keep the prairie healthy in a variety of ways. Bison graze differently than cattle do. They walk and eat. They don't stand in one place. Obviously, they had a lot more room than most cattle do. But grass is also mature at different times during the year. So bison would come through, eat what was good and ready at the time. Of course, leave droppings on the way, but also the motion of their feet helped to keep the grasslands healthy. They also would be able to find water. So you may have heard of buffalo wallows, but to roll on their backs and use their horns to bring up water, and then that water would also help birds. And so in some places where bison have been reintroduced, species of birds have returned that have not been there for a very long time. So within ecosystems, sometimes an assault, an ecosystem can recover from a particular assault on it, something that has happened, and other times not so much. Okay, so you've spent a bit of time talking about what kinds of processes, activities, and resources can help communities be sustainable. But spend a little bit of time thinking about what makes families sustainable. Think about your own families, other families that you know. Certainly families need to be able to make ends meet economically. They need to have healthy relationships. They need to meet the needs, the physical and psychosocial needs of all of their members. So how does that happen? Think about what processes or activities might degrade human sustainability. And also think about what are some key indicators of sustainability. How do we know how well we're doing? And so one way to conceptualize this visually is to think about the interactions between these different systems. Now here, nature is separated out, but each of the economic, social, and political systems are human systems. So these are a variety of different human systems. But this is one way to think about the interactions between all of these. And because there are connections between all of them, what that means is that if something happens in one system, it will spill over into other systems. So now think about, for example, if there's an economic challenge, obviously that's going to affect the ability of people to meet their own basic needs, but how is that going to contribute to social and political stability or upheaval? So you only need to watch the news to see what is happening around the world in some places where there's economic upheaval. On the other hand, if there's political upheaval, if it starts within the political system, that is going to have consequences for the economic and social systems as well. So, you can think about places like Egypt and Syria now, or South Africa in the 1980s, where there's social, economic, human, and natural factors contributing to the lack of sustainability. Or you can think of any example of failed states. What contributes to a failed state? If you think of the fall of any society, you'll be able to identify several processes that precede the fall that were unsustainable. So whether you're thinking about Rome, if you're thinking about France pre-revolution, certainly the oppression of people contributed to that, or the former Soviet Union, people were unable to meet their own individual needs. There was oppression, so there were social conditions that contributed to that lack of sustainability. Many of the refugees around the world right now were displaced at least in part by unsustainable agricultural practices that resulted in erosion and desertification and loss of arable land. Clear-cutting forests for coffee plantations, for example, you can get crops from those fields for about 5 years, and then it becomes useless. You can think about economic systems. Bankruptcies are an indicator of lack of sustainability, living beyond one's means, whether you're talking about an individual, a family, a corporation, or a community. Okay, so just a few indicators. How do we know that we're sustainable? And they talked about this in the film as well, that the infant mortality rate is comparable and life expectancy is comparable in Cuba to that of the U.S., but they consume a fraction of the resources that we do. You can use immunization rate, so how well we're protecting our citizens from preventable diseases in that way. Literacy rate is an indicator of sustainability. People need to have the education and the health resources in order to be able to support themselves and to support their families. And food security, which we usually think of this as being a problem in developing nations, but we're going to talk in our second module about food deserts in the United States, places where people really do not have access to fresh and healthy food. And this I just wanted to share with you. This is a photo, this is a NASA photo taken of the Earth at night. Think about what kinds of things you notice when you look at this picture. In some cases, you can think about how the lights indicate where civilizations arose and where you see concentrated populations. And one of the things that's evident is that you tend to see concentrated populations where there's water. Not surprising. Water provides transportation, and it's also a life-sustaining resource. But there are also places on the globe where there are huge populations, but you don't see a lot of light here, either because they're using alternative means or because they have a different kind of a lifestyle that centers more around the cycles of sunlight and darkness. One of the things that I'm also going to point out here is that this is the Korean Peninsula. This is the south part of the peninsula, and this darkness here is the north part of the peninsula. So there's a pretty stark division there. And so you can think about what the conditions are you know, the lights are turned off at night. People don't have access to that particular resource. And you know, we don't know a whole lot about what goes on in North Korea, but it's interesting that that's very evident that there is a geopolitical division here that is evident from space based on our viewing the lights at night. So just take a look, think about what that picture, what some of the patterns are, what it tells you about the arrangement, and it gives you a little bit of a global perspective on this whole Earth community, thinking about both the human communities that are living on the Earth and the living communities, the other natural communities of organisms that we're sharing the ecosystem with.